There we go. Bonjour. This is Comparing JVM Web Frameworks, and I'm Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana, no electricity, no running water, and had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. And yes, it was uphill both ways. I have an old bus project, and I'm really happy to be here. I love Paris, I love DevOps, and the last time I spoke at a DevOps was in Belgium, and I came to Paris afterwards and got engaged to Trish at Versailles. So it's a very special place for me. So now I want to know a little bit about you. How many people are currently developing web applications for the JVM? It's about 90% of the room. Has anyone written an application, a web app, with servlets and JSPs? So now you're dating yourselves. You guys have been doing it for about 10 years. Anyone using JSF or has used JSF? Got about 30% of the room. What about Grails? Any Grails folks? That's about 10%. GWT? That's about the same number. Rails, Ruby on Rails? Not very many, probably 10. Spring MVC? Boom. There goes all the hands. That's easily half, maybe 60%. What about Wicket? Okay, that's about 10 or 15. Tapestry? 5. We got 3 guys, 4. What about Play? Whole bunch of people. That almost ties with Spring MVC. And that's kind of a difference that I've seen between the US and certainly in Europe, especially France. There's a lot of people using Play. Does anyone hate a framework? Shout it out. Tapestry. Tapestry hates it. JSF. JSF. There's a whole group right here that I'm going to get along with real well. Anyone else? Anyone like Struts? Boo. Does anyone love a framework?
Yes, Stripes.
Stripes. This guy loves it. Vaadin. Play. Grails. What was that? Gwit. Called Gwit. I call it GWT, but it is called Gwit a lot. Okay, that's good. I like it. Passionate audience. So how I'm going to do this today is I'm going to talk about the history of JVM Web Frameworks, and then I'm going to talk about an interesting thing that I've recently come across called the paradox of choice. And I'm going to attempt to relate choosing and all the choices we have with how you choose a web framework. But that's not what we're really here for. We want to compare them and see, what the differences are and talk about, why one is better. And so I certainly want to do that as well. And what I encourage you to do is to ask questions and make this very much a discussion, because the slides are just kind of, supporting evidence of a lot of this stuff. But if you really want certain information, I got a lot of stuff in my head, and I'm willing to let it out, and, we can discuss these things. So web frameworks started way back in 1995 with PHP. That was more of a language than a framework, but Web Objects was certainly a framework. Then we had Netscape come out. We had Zope in the late 90s, IE4. Who remembers IE4? You guys have been doing it a long time. Yep. And then, we still didn't have many web frameworks. We had, Struts come out, and I remember when Struts 1.0 come out. I like to think of it as the killer app for Java EE, and at the time it was J2EE. But before that, there wasn't really any web frameworks. It was just servlets and JSPs, and chances are everyone had their own web framework that they wrote or used. And it was the first time that there was something that people could actually grab and use and follow a lot of best practices from, the J2EE patterns book. So it was immediately popular. It's funny that it and IE6 came out at the same time. And then we get into more frameworks. Tapestry, Servlet 2.4, now we had filters. WebWork was out, and it was a lot better than Struts. And so I did my first Comparing Web Frameworks talk. This is back in 2006? No, 2004. So I compared Struts, Spring, Tapestry, WebWork, and Java server faces. And if you'll notice, this is back in the heyday of the server side. And I actually had to hide all their ads to make this a good screenshot. But down at the bottom there, threaded messages, 96 comments. So this is back when people were very passionate about web frameworks. We had comments from all the people that wrote a web framework, including like Rod Johnson and a bunch of other folks. And it was a passionate subject. And what I tried to do there is I just tried to talk about, hey, here's these frameworks. I've tried them all. Here's things I like about them. Here's things I don't. Try them for yourselves. But then, we move forward. In 2004, a lot of big things happened in web frameworks. The biggest one was Ajax. Right? That's when the term was coined. Flex 1.0 came out as kind of a competitor. Flex 1 and Spring 1 happened at the same time. We got Wicket 1.0. We got Stripes 1.0. And then the next big thing was Ruby on Rails, convention over configuration. And that changed the landscape drastically because the majority of people, it seemed, there were a lot of PHP developers, but in the community that I knew, it was a lot of Java people, and they were like, wow, this is so much easier than the way I've been doing things. So we saw a lot of Java people move over there. And then we got more mature releases of the various frameworks. GWT, GWT came out, Rails 2.0, Struts 2, which was just WebWork renamed to Struts, and then Dojo, jQuery, which is now the de facto standard for JavaScript utility libraries, TurboGears, Symfony, some PHP frameworks. And then 2007, I went and did a talk again, and this time I added Flex, Grails, GWT, and Seam. And it's funny now that 2 of those in the last 7 years are gone. Seam is no longer being actively developed. It's now a Delta Spike project at Apache. And ironically enough, Flex is now an Apache project as well. So both JBoss and Adobe said, how about you guys take it on? We don't want them anymore. And in 2010, we had a whole bunch more frameworks. Grails 1.0 came out between 2007 and 2010. We had Play. We started to get into these JavaScript tools, closure tools, Lift 1.0, a Scala framework. GWT 2.0 is a big release. JSF 2, all of a sudden they fixed all that stuff that really stunk about JSF. And I went to DevOps and spoke in Antwerp for the first time. And people are angry. I got a lot of responses from that talk, and the reason is because it was the first time I think I had ever taken frameworks and said, this one's the best. And that's what people really seemed to want, but the people that didn't have their framework in that list of the best ones were very angry about it, and they were very passionate about it. And today, we end up with the biggest change since 2010 is HTML5 and the iPad. Right? The iPad changed the landscape for Flex. All of a sudden, Flex went, uh-oh. James Ward said, I got to get a new job. And Steve Jobs did his thoughts on Flash and said, we really don't need this. And then we had a lot of, maturity in the libraries. Prime Faces basically fixed a lot of the issues with JSF. Vaadin, which people really love, is on 7.0 release. It's the highest release of any web framework that I know of. Grails 2.0 continued the Grails legacy. Play guys decided to rewrite everything. And I think that's working. The last framework that tried that was Tapestry, and they survived. But it is a tough thing to pull off, erasing your backwards compatibility. So, are there too many web frameworks? Yes. No? We got a no? Who thinks yes? That's the majority of the audience. They used to make fun of Java for so many web frameworks. And then JavaScript came along. They got a lot too. But you know what? There's also too many choices of jeans when you go to the store. You can get loose fit, you can get tight fit, you can get baggy, you can get short-legged. There's too many car choices, right? When you go to the car lot, but our choices are limited with cars because of price, right? You can easily say, well, I want a Lamborghini, but the kids don't fit in the back, and I can't afford it anyway. But they're all constrained. So with jeans, it's not so much, but you'll constrain them by how they fit, right? You'll try them on and say, okay, I like this pair of jeans. With cars, it's usually price, or can you fit your whole family in it? And with taste, with foods, you taste them, you try them, and then decide which ones you like. And the interesting thing about a lot of that is we actually make an incredible number of choices from the moment we get out of bed in the morning. But what we've done is we've stopped making certain choices, and so we just go with it. It's automatic, and then we don't have to worry about it. So what's happened since then? Remember Sophia? Raise the hands. Service-oriented front-end architecture. There's also SUI, service-oriented UI. Sophia was introduced in Life Above the Service Tier was the name of the article on October 12th, 2007. And it was a server-side article. It was by a bunch of researchers. There was also the guys who started Accelerator, now Titanium, introduced SOUI on InfoQ, the dueling news outlets for Java, in a month later, almost exactly, November 2007. And so what they said is, hey, it's the death of MVC. These MVC frameworks are over. We're going to have this type of architecture where your back end serves up JSON or XML, and then your front end does all the MVC. And truth be told, they were right. And this kind of happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Now we have all these JavaScript MVC frameworks and fast JavaScript engines and HTML5 that allows us to do a lot of that stuff on the client. Is also motivated by HTML5 and PhoneGap, right? We wanted to take these web apps that we've made and make them work on a mobile device. And we wanted everything to be local because if we serve it up on the mobile web, it's going to be slow on those mobile connections. So a lot of the Sophia stuff happened, but they had a lot of issues with the performance. This back slide that's covered up there is from Twitter. There's one from Airbnb, and this is from the inventor of, Scriptaculous. And basically what they've all had issues with is rendering HTML on the client with JavaScript. From a performance perspective, it doesn't scale, and with Twitter, they've actually had to put everything on the server. So what this means is traditional web frameworks are still relevant. That's why you're here. This still matters, people still care about it, and you still want to generate HTML on the server. So that brings me into the paradox of choice. Autonomy and freedom of choice are critical to our well-being. This is what makes us human. This is what makes us, want to do stuff, is that we have more choice than any group ever before us, before any people. And we don't seem to be benefiting from it psychologically. They've done studies, and since the 60s, this is in America, I don't know if it applies to France, but the level of depression has tripled since those days, and the general happiness of people has gone down a fair amount, and they attribute a lot of it to too many choices. Choices haven't gotten any easier. I mean, now you go to the grocery store and you just want to buy potato chips, and there's like both sides are all those potato chips, so you just close your eyes and pick one. And that's what happens is people, instead of being choosers and actually, thinking about each little choice, they become pickers, and they just grab something and go with it. So one of the things the book talks about is how to make good decisions. It involves figuring out your goal or goals. This is number one. Number two, evaluating the importance of each goal, and then array the options, look at them all, evaluate how likely each of them is going to meet your goal, pick the winning option, and modify your goals. So you pick the winning option, you work with it, doesn't work, modify your goals, pick a new one, things of that sort. So most times when you buy a car, when you buy jeans, or when you buy food, most good decisions will involve this step. And people that make bad decisions, chances are they aren't going through this process. So a chooser thinks about the possibilities. If they can't decide among any that they like, they'll actually create their own. So that's kind of happened in Java Web Frameworks, where people have created new frameworks just because there wasn't one out there that satisfied their needs. A picker just grabs and hopes for the best. And a proliferation of choices, the too many choices, robs us of the opportunity to decide for ourselves and just how important a decision is a lot of the times. And so the thing that really struck me about this book and about the people that are angry or don't like web frameworks or really want the best one is this concept of maximizers versus satisficers. So maximizers try to make the best possible choice. These are the people who will go to the store to buy a sweater, and they will go to every store in town to find the sweater at the best price. And they will keep looking, and even after they buy it, they might have buyer's remorse. With satisficers, they just try to make the first suitable choice, the best available, and then go with it. If you see and accept only the best, you're a maximizer. And I think the easiest ways to choose a web framework is to narrow the number of choices. So if we're talking about, someone recently sent me an email and said there's 277 web frameworks. If you have to choose from 277, oh my God. I'm just going to pick Spring MVC or Gwt and be done. Right? You're going to become a picker. But if you have 5 to choose from, that sounds a little more reasonable. If you tell me Struts 1 versus Struts 2, done. That's an easy decision, right? So the less you have, the more constraints you have to get your frameworks down to a certain number, I think is the best way to do it. And you know, the real problem is how do you eliminate certain frameworks? How do you establish constraints so you can eliminate certain frameworks from your criteria? And the real problem is with a lot of these, I mean, you're choosing between a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, and a Bugatti Veyron, right? And the Bugatti is $1 million too, so yeah, maybe I'll take that and then sell it and buy, you know, 5 Ferraris. But still, it's you know, these are all really nice frameworks that we get to use. The easiest thing is just don't choose Struts. So, they did the end of life last week, voting on the mailing list, and I think there's some articles coming out this week or next where it's no longer supported by the developers, so you shouldn't choose it. So I've tried to constrain my choices over the years with a number of different ideas. In 2006, I tried to do it based on the type of app you were developing. So I said if you were doing an internal desktop-like app, probably choose one of the component-based frameworks, like Wicked or JSF. But if you really need to scale, and I worked at LinkedIn at the time, and they were having issues with scaling, so they wanted stateless. And so I said if you plan to be big and you plan to have a framework that gets millions of users or an app that gets millions of users, then try to use something like Struts or Spring MVC and don't use a session. Make sure you do everything with caching and on the client, stuff like that. And then 2010 I said choose based on these 20 different criteria. And people really didn't have a problem, I think, with the different criteria. They had a problem with my rankings on certain frameworks. They were like, why did you give JSF a 1 here? It deserves a 0 everywhere. And then in 2013, I wrote a blog post about this in January about, I'm just going to narrow it down to 5. I'm going to talk about community and support, HTML5, REST support, mobile ability, performance, and page speed. But then I started thinking about it, and I said, for mobile support, does that mean like you can build an app on the client, or does it mean you can have responsive design so that people can view it on their smartphone? And so mobile support really just became CSS3. Everyone supports CSS3. So I started looking at these and was like, I don't know if these make sense. And what I came up with is there's a bunch of predetermined constraints, I believe, that everyone has. A lot of times it's language. Like in companies, they've standardized on Java. Maybe they'll let you use Groovy. Maybe they'll let you use Scala. Or it's a .NET shop, right? Or it's Python. And so a lot of times those constraints are put in place by architects or founders of a company. And then it's platform. It's LAMP, it's .NET, it's the JVM. We're going to use one of those. And then I think it comes down to the app type. And this is the biggest change that I've made in this presentation and in my evaluation of web frameworks, is I don't think that there's that much greenfield development going on. And greenfield development means basically you start the app from scratch. You talk to a brand new database and you make it work. And so in that kind of instance, if you do have greenfield development and you don't have language and you don't have platform, well, you just pick what the architect on the project or the founder of the company wants to use. Right? He's a Python guy, so he's going to use Django. They're going to deploy it on Apache. It's all going to work. But with a lot of Java shops and a lot of Java companies, they've already standardized in Java the language. Maybe they'll let you branch out, but they're running on Tomcat, and basically you have to pick a framework that goes on top of that. And what I've seen with Overstock, and I've seen it, I'm a consultant for Oracle, and I've been there for about a year. Overstock.com, I worked at LinkedIn, and they all have these backends that are running just fine. They use Spring and Hibernate. They scale fine. They use JMS to do a lot of the message passing. And yes, their web framework isn't that great because like the architect that founded the company wrote it himself, and it's a little outdated. But they don't want to replace any of the backend. So all they want to do is have a new web framework that's more productive. And a lot of times that is not going to be a Grails. That's not going to be a Ruby on Rails. That's going to have to be something that's Java-based. Right? It's going to have to be Spring MVC, or it's going to have to be Tapestry, or something of that sort. So the easiest thing you can do to improve your life is choose the JVM. So give yourselves a pat on the back if you've done that. You're not constrained by languages, right? There's a number of languages you can use. You have the scalability that powers some of the largest web companies today. And I don't think it's fair to compare all web frameworks that run on the JVM because apps have different requirements. So what I'm going to try to do is, taking all these different languages, is settle it into the different types of frameworks. So after you choose the best platform out there, I encourage you to get a new laptop. SSDs are real cheap. Memory is real cheap. You can get 16 gigs for $115 on your laptop. So I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to use IntelliJ. So now you got everything going for you. Let's look at the frameworks. I think there's 3 different kinds. And so you have to align your goals with your decision with these 3 different kinds of frameworks. There's pure web frameworks, which don't have a backend, don't have any component that talks to a database. There's full stack frameworks that have everything you need, a lot of times including a build system. They've either wrote their own or they've adopted a new one that no one else uses, and then they try to integrate it with Maven. And then there's Sophia frameworks. So it's great to choose one of these JavaScript frameworks, and I've been doing this at Oracle. I've been developing a new feature in this large cloud app that uses AngularJS to do a lot of its logic and its MVC stuff, and unfortunately, there's no API to talk to. And so a lot of the benefits of Angular kind of go out the window because there's not, the resource stuff that I can use. But I can still talk to, JavaScript variables that have JSON in a JSP page. So you can still use those, but I think those are the 3 different categories of frameworks. And, from there, there's the full stack frameworks. So before we get started here looking at all the different ones, I'm assuming you've heard of Tamir Kassan and the relationship between facial hair and computer language. People heard this theory? That all the good languages, the guys have beards? And the ones that haven't succeeded, they're clean shaven? So James Gosling is one, obviously. There's Von Rossum from Python. There's, the guy from Ruby, and the guy from JavaScript even has a beard. But basic Perl and C#, there's no facial hair. I think it's possible that something like that exists for web frameworks, but it's the logos. So if you have a logo that's not that great, then I think you stand a chance of not being a great framework. So we're gonna explore that as we go through here. So if we look at the full stack frameworks, we basically on the JVM, it's not Ruby on Rails, it's JRuby on Rails. And that's one of the things that I did when I limited my stats and my research gathering is to use JRuby instead of Ruby on Rails, because you do Ruby on Rails and it blows everyone else away, right? There's so many. But for people actually developing on the JVM, I think a lot of times they search for JRuby on Rails and they use that as a search term. There's Grails, there's Play, there's Lift, Spring Roo, and then Seam. Those are the 6 that I know of that are full stack frameworks on the JVM. Is there any that I've missed here that people are using? Okay. The API framework, so this is what produces your JSON and your REST services on the back end. I believe there's 5 of them that are the most popular. There's Glassfish and Jersey, which logo-wise, not that great. REST Easy is pretty good from JBoss. Apache CXF, they don't even have a logo. I had to screenshot that off their website. And then Vertex, they don't have one either, but someone produced this and I found it, so they kind of have one. And then Drop Wizard is another one. And probably all of these use Jackson for their JSON processing. So if you're doing JSON, anything with JSON in Java, Jackson is the best library to use, and I've had great success with it. And then we move on to the JavaScript MVC frameworks. There's basically 10 here that I think are important to look at. There's Backbone, Sprout Core, SammyJS, AngularJS, Batman, and Knockout. And you'll notice that a lot of these have really good logos. Right? Ember, I don't know, that one's kind of funky with the little furry guy there. Spine, maybe take that one out. Sprout Core, GWT, they've had the toolbox forever, so, good job there. I'm not going to talk about comparing JavaScript MVC frameworks because this is a JVM Web Frameworks talk. Gordon Hempton has already done this. So this is back in January 2012. He takes all 10, evaluates them, and he actually adds Angular after the fact. And when you download my presentations, this is a clickable link that you can go to, that site and read about it. But he says Ember.js is the best one. And I've heard that from a lot of people. They really like it. I think Angular is certainly gaining momentum, and we'll see that in some of my later slides. But those are kind of competing for the top as well as Backbone. Backbone is the one that had the momentum from the very beginning, and so those are kind of the top 3 in that area. So if we look at pure JVM Web Frameworks, I think there's a slew of them that are relevant in the Java space, and this is a lot of people telling me, why didn't you, add click, or why didn't you add ZK and stuff like that to your comparison? So now they're on here, and a lot of this is from Wikipedia. So they have comparison to web application frameworks, and they have a Java section, and there's about 30 in there, but some of them I haven't heard of, or they're not maintaining them anymore, so I didn't bother to include them. So interestingly enough, Apache has a whole bunch of them. Wicket, Struts, Sling, which talks to a JCR, Java Content Repository, Tapestry, and Click. And if you've seen, is there any Click developers or people that work on the Click framework in the room? Okay, now I can say bad stuff about your logo. You need work on your logo, because it's just like a C on a blue background, and that kind of takes it out of the running right there. With GWT, I've had an interesting run-in with GWT lately. I actually developed with GWT for a whole year in 2009, I believe it was. I worked at Evite.com, a company out in LA that does like online invitations, and we rewrote a lot of their stuff with GWT. And then I worked for another company that produced like an IDE in the browser, and we used GXT for that. So I have a lot of GWT experience. Haven't used it for a couple of years, and they've developed a whole bunch of new patterns. And they've recently, a guy contributed a bunch of stuff to my AppFuse project for using GWT, and I'll talk about that later. But I think with GWT, a lot of times you're going to need another framework, like Smart GWT, like GXT, like Vaadin, and the one from JBoss, I think it's Eri. And then with JSF, similarly, you're not just going to use the Mahora reference implementation or MyFaces. You're probably going to use, a component library with it, like Ice Faces or Rich Faces or Prime Faces. And then there's the rest. These ones that have, stood out on their own. They're not a standard, they're not GWT, and they're not Apache. Spring MVC obviously is one that's done really well. Stripes is still out there, and Gear is going to revive Rife. Now it's coming back, it's making a comeback. And then ZK. I hear a lot of things about ZK where people that use it really like it. The ones that I've used basically is Wicket, Struts, Tapestry, GXT, the MyFaces and Mahora, and then Spring MVC and Stripes. So what I'm trying not to do this time is talk about frameworks that I haven't used. So I'm sorry, Vaadin, I'm sorry, Rich Faces, but I don't think I can say bad things about you because I haven't used you. So one of the things that I introduced at DevOps 2 years ago was the comparison matrix. This was a controversial thing that basically allowed you to say, okay, I have 20 frameworks, I have 20 criteria, let's rank all of them. And for developer productivity, you either get a 0.5 if it's possible to reload classes, or you get a 1.0 if I never have to restart anything. So if you're using Grails or Play, like those things are awesome, right? Tapestry 5 has got built in, so you got live reloading of classes. But a lot of the other ones, you got to either use JRebel, to restart it on the fly, or you got to stop and start your server. And then project health, right? How healthy is the project? How many releases have they had? Scalability, are they taking in scalability concerns and figuring out how to do those? How's their validation framework? How many books have they had published? Some people care about that, some people don't. And so I took all those, put them into this matrix, and what came out was the results. Grails looks like one of the best ones. Spring MVC, Rails, and GWT are kind of tied, and Vaadin and Tapestry kind of come out from that. And so one of the things that I've changed just in the last month is JSF. I took from a 0 to a 0.5 for developer perception, because there's passionate JSF people out there. Flex, I took it down from a 1 to a 0.5, because I don't think developers look at Flex anymore and are like, I want to use that. Tapestry, their project health, I took from a 0.5 to a 1, and Play got multi-language from a 0.5 to a 1. So everyone increased a little. You can see that Lift is still down there. I haven't used it, so that's probably invalid. But Flex is down there, and it probably should be because of no flash on iPads. So there's the results. And then the matrix really isn't fair, because chances are you don't care about some things. You might not care about Ajax because you're writing a government app and they don't want JavaScript. Or you don't care about the books published because you're going to write one and make a bunch of money off it. Or you don't care about multi-language support because you're just going to use Java. So what I created is this weighted matrix that basically says, okay, for certain things it's more important that they have mobile support, it's more important that there's no degree of risk, and that the learning curve is shallow. And so if I pop a few things in there, then Grails comes out on top and plays a close second, and Spring MVC is third, and Ruby on Rails is right behind it. But then you'll notice one of my categories is like mobile and iPhone support. And I gave Play a 1.0. But can you really write a Play app that goes on a phone and installs on the phone? No, it's mostly an app that sits on a server and they talk to it. And the mobile support is really that they support CSS3, which everyone does. So I don't know how valid it is. So if we take that and we say, okay, well, that's Raible's opinion, that's his matrix, we can use it, we can tweak it. The beauty thing of the matrix is you can make it say your framework is the best. And that's what I've seen is I've had clients that have actually wanted to use a particular framework. They hired me as a consultant, and my goal with the matrix was, here, you don't have to hire me. Just take this, do the rankings yourself, maybe try it out, and then you can figure it out on your own. Because most of my clients already knew what they wanted. Right? They just wanted a consultant to come in and tell them, yes, you should use Gwt. So I had some reactions, and I wanted to look at some other people's way of comparing web frameworks and how they chose the best one. So David Pollack, he's the author of Lift. Lift gets an 11 on a 1 scale, 0.5 and 1. Rails gets a 5, and most Java-based frameworks get a 1 or less. He doesn't like Java. Developer perception, every web framework gets a 1 because everyone likes the framework they're using. Learning curve, Lift gets a 2, so he admits it's hard to learn. And job trends, yeah, there isn't any. So that's a pretty interesting comeback. Peter Thomas did a bunch of performance comparisons with Seam and JSF, and in January 2009, so it's a couple years old, and Wicket's now 6.0 and Seam is gone. But he was basically able to prove that Seam was a fair amount slower and used a lot more memory than Wicket did. So on the Seam and JSF side, the 20 sessions took up about 800K, adding up to 16 megs. Wicket side was only 1.5 megs. So on the server, how much it used was quite a bit different. And there's a great post, if you click on that link or go to it after the session, between Peter and the Seam developers just yelling at each other. And Gavin King from Hibernate, that guy likes to yell on forums, so it's entertaining. And then Peter Thomas added Tapestry 5 and Grails in September of that year. He found that Grails was far more productive than Tapestry 5. Still has some ways to go in terms of performance. Found Wicket was fastest, Tapestry coming a close second. Wicket takes up the least amount of heap, which was surprising because it's a very stateful framework, and Grails tries to be a little more stateless. And then Seam plus JSF was still using a whole lot on the server. And this is the interesting thing about choice, is a lot of times you'll be influenced by your peers and people that have directly worked with these frameworks. And I found that I'm very much influenced by companies that I've worked at that have used, I've heard horror stories about Wicket and JSF, and it's a lot of times when they try to scale, when they have millions of users and they try to take these frameworks and pop them into production over something that they wrote that was stateless, and just trying to get it to scale. So I'm certainly biased and influenced like that. I'm sure you are too if you've heard someone say, I tried Spring MVC and got it, just the annotations, or I had to inherit everything, back in the day. So, you can be influenced that way. And then one of the best performance comparisons I ever saw, or web frameworks comparisons, was from DevOps in 2011 by Stan van den Linden. Is he here? No. The Worldwide Weight. And it was a performance comparison of Java Web Frameworks. They had GWT or Gwt, JSF. They used both Mahora and MyFaces. They had Spring MVC, and they had Wicket. And you can watch this study on parlays. And basically, they did a line of code comparison. And you can see here that JSF and Spring MVC didn't require much code. But then, at the same time, Gwt required twice as much as even Wicket. And then page size, Gwt was pretty small. They show all the frameworks they used with it as well. So they gathered 16 gigs of data, 700 hours of test runs, and what they found was that basically it was wicked expensive to run JSF, just on memory costs and space needed, and pretty cheap to run GWT. But the interesting thing about that is there's twice as much code for Gwt. So it might take you twice as long to run it, but once you get into production, it'll be cheaper. And they also found that a lot of the bottlenecks in this whole thing was the database. It was never the web framework. It was the database and the connection pool and things they had to tune there. And then last year in October, we get one from InfoQ. And so what InfoQ did is they surveyed all their readers, and this turned out to be about 1,000, 1,500 people on the different web frameworks out there and what they liked. And Spring MVC came out on top. Adoption ready, you should use it. 600 people voted for that. And then Play was a close second. The numbers weren't quite there on adoption ready, but certainly a lot of votes for it. Grails was third, then JSF, and then Struts, and then Wicket. So a lot of these kind of line up. And then there's also this new site that I found called DevRatescom, and they have a way of ranking frameworks by rating and by popularity. So you can see here, if you just look at the ratings that people have given them, there's a lot of Prime Faces fans, there's a lot of Grails fans, a lot of Tapestry 5, Vaadin, Wicket, EXTJS sneaked in there, Django, and Play. And then if we do it by popularity, Grails sneaks up to the top. We got Gwit, Prime Faces, Play, Struts. So a lot of the same frameworks are showing up in a lot of these different comparisons. So if I look at that and take all these 4 different ratings, my matrix says that, Grails, GWT, Rails, Spring MVC are kind of up there. If you weight them, then it's Grails and Play and Spring MVC. Peter Thomas is a Wicket fan. I think he always will be. But he hates JSF, so it kind of balances out. InfoQ, Spring MVC, Play, Grails, JSF, Struts, and then DevRatescom kind of puts, a similar class of frameworks in there. So it's not just me saying that here's the top 5. It's, other people, other surveys, and other sites. So my recommendations for if you're going to choose a full stack framework, remember trying to limit choices or trying to make it easy for you, is choose by the language. Do you want to do Ruby, Groovy, Java, or Scala? And if you pick Java, well, it's pretty easy. You got to use Play or Spring Root, right? Those are really the only options that allow you to use Java. You could have done Seam, but it's no longer maintained. If you want to do Scala, Lift, and Play. So just pick between those two. If you want to do JRuby, well, decision over, right? Ruby on Rails, we're doing it. But when it comes to a pure web framework, it's a little bit trickier because you still have 6 of them here. Spring MVC, Struts 2, JSF, Tapestry 5, Wicket, or Vaadin. And the reason I have a Vaadin in there instead of Gwit is because this is what happened when this guy contributed the GWT stuff to AppFuse. I found that the lines of Java required for the Gwit client was like 5,000 versus the rest of the frameworks were around 1,000. So 5 times as much code for lines of code. Number of files, almost 200 versus a lot less. And this is the same functionality across frameworks implemented. So in my 3 years from being detracted from Gwit, I've found that a lot of the patterns and the recommendations they've had have just required developers to write a whole lot of code to follow best practices. But if you're using something like Vaadin or Eri or Smart GWT or GXT, a lot of those have those built in, right? It's part of the framework itself, so you write a lot less code. So I would recommend if you use Gwit and you like the theming that some other framework has or some component library, then you might want to use that. And so if we take that and we say, okay, how do we eliminate that? We got 6 web frameworks, pure web frameworks, and the other ones, how do we get them down? Well, here's some other options. You can limit them by adding elimination criteria. You can say, hey, I want 1 release last year, I want at least 1 book, I want at least 10 jobs, and at least 250 questions on Stack Overflow. And you could probably get this down to a few frameworks. And we'll remove Seam from this analysis because it's done. So if we look at pretty graphs now, we get into the jobs on Dice.com. And you guys might have a better site over here, but this is a pretty good indicator in the US. This is for the last 30 days. You can see that there's a bunch of people looking for Grails folks. JRuby on Rails, not so much. Play, hardly any. Lift and Spring Root is the same way. And so this can be interpreted 2 different ways. Do you want to be a Grails consultant and compete with all the other people that do Grails? Or do you want to be a Play consultant, and since there's only 3 jobs, maybe you can get a higher rate. Who knows? The pure web frameworks, there's a ton of Spring MVC jobs. Not that many Struts 2, but it is, the second one. Wicket, Tapestry, Prime Faces, and Vaadin. So if you do JSF, a lot of times you get Joint Strike Fighter, which is a jet that they want mechanics for, so that one's tough to search for. But if you just did JSF, I think it's similar to to GWT, where it's rare that people are just going to use the raw framework without some component library on top of it, and Prime Faces seems to be the leader. If you look at JavaScript MVC frameworks, Backbone is leading there. It's been around longer. A lot of people, are hiring for it. Ember and Angular are kind of tied. And if you look at the API frameworks, there's a ton of people looking for jobs. I hope it's not in New Jersey, but it's around, Jersey framework. And then Apache CXF, which they're kind of, dispelling the myth of their logo right there. Rest Easy, there's only 6. Drop Wizard has 2, and Vertex has 3. So not many people looking for help with those frameworks, but Drop Wizard at the same time uses Jersey underneath and Maven and stuff like that. So it's not really a standalone kind of framework. And then if we look at LinkedIn skills, so these are people that have these skills. If you search on LinkedIn, you find out their profiles and who has what. You find out that there's a ton of people that know Grails. With Play, there's a lot of people growing rapidly. Spring Roo, Ruby on Rails, and Lyft, not so much. With the pure web frameworks, Spring MVC, Struts 2 is in second there again. And every time that I'm searching for Struts 2, I'm using Struts 2 in quotes, so hopefully I'm not picking up Struts 1. Then Wicket and Prime Faces. So, this kind of reflects what the matrix says. And then, the LinkedIn skills, a ton of people know Backbone, not so many with Angular, and Ember is actually even lower. The API frameworks, again, Jersey shows a ton of people know it or put it on their profile, and then CXF. And then if we look at trends, Google Trends, so this is people searching on the internet since 2004. This is JRuby, Rails, Grails, Play Framework, in quotes, Lyft, Scala, Spring Roo. And you can see that Grails is really leading the pack there and has done really well and has a lot of people, searching for information on it. That could be because their documentation sucks, but it is Spring source, so it's usually pretty good. And then interest over time with Spring MVC, Struts 2, JSF, you can kind of see Spring MVC did a steady climb there. Struts 2 is rocking the house in 2007, and then they've had a steady decline since about 2009. Then Tapestry and Wicket and JSF are kind of down at the bottom. But you can see there JSF Prime Faces, the yellow line, is actually picking it up a little and starting to trend upwards. And then if we look at Ember and Angular and Backbone, this is what shows that Angular is really taken off. It's got the hockey stick, right, shooting to the sky. And then here's Jersey, CXF, Rest Easy, Drop Wizard, and Vertex. Vertex is that purple line. It's got a bunch of hops there, probably because of the VMware and Red Hat thing. And Jersey is still trending up, so it's the most popular API framework. If we look at Indeed job trends, Grails, kicking butt, Spring MVC, doing very well, Backbone, doing real well, and then Jersey Java. And the interesting thing about this is I think the reason that Spring MVC and Grails has done so well is because those guys are so on backwards compatibility. Like you can go from a Spring MVC 1.0 app to a Spring MVC 3.2, chances are drop in the jars and it'll all work. Struts, you couldn't do that. It was 2 different frameworks. It was almost a mistake to choose that Struts 2 as a name. Tapestry 4 to 5 couldn't do that. Even Play 1 to 2, right? And Play is an interesting story because it's the first time that we've had a framework rewrite itself and then have people actually revive the first version. With Tapestry 4, they let it die. With Struts 1, they've let it die. And Play 1 actually has people that are trying to maintain it and revive it as a framework. So a passionate community, which is good. And then mailing list traffic. Play has the most, but Angular's kicking its butt. And could be good or bad, right? The Wicket guys back in the day said that, mailing list traffic just means it's got a bunch of bugs. And then I did this comparison one year and they had the most. And they were like, okay, maybe it means something. But Lyft, you can see, is a very active community. Grails, Wicket, and Tapestry are doing well, but Struts had 82 messages in a whole month. I mean, that's almost worse than AppFuse. So, interesting. If we look at Stack Overflow, I had to take Spring out of here because Spring MVC does not have a tag, and Spring's tag is like 26,000, right? So it's just, and it encompasses everything. So in Stack Overflow, it's kind of tough to search. But there's a lot of people asking questions about Grails and Play, not so much with Lyft and JRuby on Rails. For the pure web frameworks, Struts 2 and Prime Faces, and then Wicket, Vaadin, and Tapestry in that order. And then Backbone, a lot of people using that, a lot of people liking it. And then Jersey, Apache CXF. So these all, across all these different statistics kind of mirror the same thing. But the beauty is that Java remains, in spite of the fragmented language landscape, a viable growing language. In Java 8, I don't know if you've seen some blog posts this week about it, but people are very excited about it. It's got some real cool stuff coming. So what you need to remember is that if you're going to be a Java web developer, first of all, you got all these choices, and I know it's hard and it can be overwhelming with so many, but whittle it down to the type of framework you're developing, the type of goals you have, and just concentrate on 2 or 3 frameworks. And be a satisficer. Just try to pick one that's good enough, right? And if you have issues with it, talk about them. Tell other people, tell your peers, write it on a blog post, put it on Twitter, and if you have success with it, that's what we need more of. We need more people with an attitude of gratitude that are expressing happiness with these frameworks so other people can read that, and it also makes you happier when you have an attitude of gratitude. And the modern principles of web development, this is a great post from Atlassian, design for mobile first, build one-page apps, but at the same time what we've seen over the last couple of years is instead of just getting JSON for your one-page app, you might get whole chunks of HTML and still use the server-side framework to generate those. Create and use your REST API, and sex sells. And so make sure that you make nice-looking web apps. Use Bootstrap if you have to, but at the same time, customize it so it looks good and it doesn't look like every other Bootstrap site out there. For the modern JVM web developer, start with fast hardware, use IntelliJ. The reason I recommend IntelliJ is for JavaScript and CSS. Eclipse has nothing like it, or at least not yet. NetBeans is trying to get there, but code completion in CSS and JavaScript is awesome. Learn your JavaScript, learn your HTML5, create high-performance sites for mobile devices in the cloud, and give a shit about security because people are hacking into stuff left and right. So it matters, and it's pretty easy to stop a lot of that. But the crazy thing is with these web frameworks, a lot of people are looking for more productivity, but what Zero Turnaround found is that the real problem might not be your web framework. It doesn't mean you'll actually be productive if you get something like Grails, because chances are the real reasons you're not getting stuff done is because you're multitasking and you're doing boring tasks. So it might be your job, it might not be your web framework that's causing problems. And there is no best web framework. Don't try to be a maximizer. Don't try all the frameworks and figure out what the best one is, because it'll probably change even in your mind over the years. And everyone is biased, especially the authors of the frameworks, people like me, people that have experiences. And so there's lots of awesome choices out there. You should probably not listen to me. And you should choose your own. Prioritize a list of goals for each of the different frameworks. Chances are if you're using one that's good enough, it is good enough. You shouldn't worry about other frameworks out there just because a new one came along last week. If you try it for a week, you'll probably find out it's got its bugs too. You can document and rank them if you want. Don't be a picker. Actually try to choose, try to analyze each of these frameworks. Satisfy more and maximize less. That's it. Any questions? All right, I think you're free. I'll post these slides up on SlideShare probably by the end of the day.
Hi. Could you dissociate Play 1 and Play 2 maybe on the list, since Play 1 has an active community on its own?
Someone asked me to do that, and I said I would not because the latest version implies that it's the best one by the authors themselves.
Okay. Thank you.
Or else I would have called it something else.
Hello.
Hello.
You provide a stack, AppFuse. What are your next objective for the stacks? Will you still produce it, or?
So he's asking about AppFuse, and I write that, and there's a lot of other contributors to it. And we've recently added GWT, and we've recently added Wicket. And like I've said, I think the server-side frameworks are still viable. I am looking into adding AngularJS. But what I really like about AppFuse is I've been doing it for 9 years, and it's really shown these frameworks over time, and the ones that have gotten better, the ones that haven't done anything, and the ones that break backwards compatibility between releases. It's been a real pain in the butt to maintain Tapestry and JSF. Spring MVC and Struts 2 have been easy. You know, between releases, it's just drop it in and maybe tweak a few things and you're good to go. But I do like the JavaScript MVC stuff, and I've had a really good time with Angular. So.
Last one.
Yeah.
Is it fair to compare lines of code or only Java lines and Java plus, not Java plus JavaScript?
Right, and that's what I've tried to do and any time I compared lines of code, it was just Java. Does that answer the question, or you're saying it's not fair? Comparing JavaScript? Well, a lot of times with JavaScript, it's just libraries, right? So if you add in jQuery, then it's true, but that's like taking the lines of code from the framework and including it, right? It depends on the application, right? If it's got a lot of JavaScript. Or are you saying GWT, the lines it produces? That's a good point. Done? You need?